Good morning. It's great to have everyone here to discuss in detail the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's UK Poverty 2024 report, which was published yesterday. And just that, JRF have never had so many people sign up for one of their webinars. There's about 1,700 registered, so it's a very large number of you here joining us today. I'm Mubin, and I'm going to be chairing today's event. I'm the Chief Executive of a Financial Fairness Trust. The Trust is an independent funder supporting policy, research and advocacy work to improve the living standards of those living on low to middle incomes in the UK and to tackle the many financial problems so many of us have been facing. We work on a range of issues from wages to pensions to taxation and social security. So today we're going to be talking about many of these financial issues, but in the context of the next general election, which I'm sure hasn't escaped anyone's attention. The latest date for the election to be held is 28th of January, so we might have a whole year to wait before we have a new government, hopefully sooner. Since the last election, we have had two big shocks to our living standards, the pandemic and more recently, the cost of living crisis. Now, these events have affected all of us, and it would be too easy to say that we're all in the same boat. The reality is that we aren't. Many of us are staying afloat, but there's a large number who are sinking. And that's what today's event is going to be focusing on, those facing the greatest hardship. A report we published earlier this week found that a decade ago, a single adult on benefits would need to spend 73% of their income just on food and energy costs. Today, the benefits would fall 22% short of meeting those costs. And that's pretty shocking in this day and age, but that's where we've got to. And JRF's report highlights how the gap in income for people to escape poverty is growing and how little progress has been made in reducing poverty. It's actually been 20 years since we last saw a sustained fall in poverty in the UK. And over that time, very deep poverty has been rising. Disturbing signs of hardship all around us. Food banks and the number of families living in temporary accommodation are not what we should expect in one of the world's largest economies. The year ahead is one of important choices. In the upcoming election, political parties will set out what they stand for and the sort of country they wish to help to shape. Improving living standards, tackling inequality, and turning the tide on poverty must be at the heart of this. But we also face difficult financial constraints and hard choices, as a report from the IFS today highlights. Tax cuts today add to the risk of tax rises or spending cuts tomorrow. So we're going to delve into the problems and potential solutions today with presentations from the report's authors and responses from an excellent panel. But before that, some housekeeping. So just due to the number of people attending this webinar, your microphones and cameras will remain off and the chat function has been disabled. The Q&A function is open to submit questions to our speakers and questions can be submitted throughout the session. If your questions are related to data, methodology or research, JRF's analysis team are standing by to answer those questions. I think we've got a team of 6 on that, so you're on very capable hands. And all other questions will be added to the list to discuss during the Q&A. As there's over 1,000 of you on this call, it's very likely we won't be able to answer all of the questions. And so that's where the upvote feature has been enabled. So if you like a question, if you want it answered, please upvote it, as it means it's easier for us to prioritize which questions to ask. And this webinar will be recorded, so we'll be able to return to it later or share it with colleagues. We'll email all of you when the recording is available, and it will be on JRF's YouTube channel, and the slides will also be available. If you have any technical issues, please email events@jrf.org.uk. And if you wish to tweet, rather, I'm not sure, do you say X now? It's one of those. If, yeah, it's very odd change of name. But if you want to tweet while the event is running, the hashtag for this event is hashtag UK Poverty 2024. So to start us off, we've got Paul Kissack. He's the Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, to give us an overview of the research. Paul joined JRF in 2020 and previously served in a number of senior civil service roles focused on economic and social policy issues and public service reform. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mubin, and thank you to the hundreds of you who have turned out this morning to join the webinar and find out more about our report. It's great to see such interest in this really important topic. I'm going to speak very, very briefly, partly because we've got such a great panel ahead. And what I really want to do is try within 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes, to leave you with sort of 5 headline takeaway messages from the report that we published earlier in the week. So I'll get straight into it. So message number 1, poverty levels are very high in the UK. So the data that we published earlier, or the report we published earlier in the week with the latest data, which is from 2021-22, shows 14.4 million people in the UK in poverty. That's around about 1 in 5 people in the country. And that's a return to the kind of levels we saw immediately pre-pandemic. It also includes 4.2 million children. So that's nearly 3 in 10 children in the UK living in poverty. So that's message number 1. Poverty levels in the UK are high. The second message is that some people, some groups of people face particularly high levels of poverty. So against that overall poverty rate of about 22%, you can see different groups with a much higher poverty rate than that. So those with informal caring responsibilities will see a poverty rate of around 28%. Those with people with disabilities will see a poverty rate of around 31%. We'll keep going up with these poverty rates. Larger families, so those with 3 or more children or lone parent families, have poverty rates above 40%. The same is true of those in social rented housing, around 43%. And families claiming income-related benefits, including universal credit, it's 49%, the poverty rate. And then for some minoritized communities, the poverty rate is actually above 50%. So if you are living in a Pakistani or Bangladeshi household, for example, you are more likely to be in poverty than not. So the second message is, alongside that high headline poverty rate, some groups face a much higher, in some cases appallingly high levels of the chances of being in poverty. The third message, which Mubin referred to, was that overall we are not making progress. So it's now been 20 years and 6 prime ministers since the last period where we saw a sustained fall in poverty in the UK. That was a period which actually ran from the very late 1990s through to 2004, a period when Stephen was a minister in the Treasury. I was a very junior official in the Treasury, and I don't know how it feels to Stephen, but it feels like a very, very long time ago. And it's 20 years ago is a long time for us to have made no discernible progress in the headline rates of poverty. The very, very big increase we saw in poverty rates during the Thatcher period has never been reversed, and we've really made very little progress, particularly over the last 20 years. It's actually worse than that. So my fourth message is that poverty is deepening. So while the headline rate hasn't shifted greatly, what we see is if you look at the makeup of people in poverty and how then the depth of poverty, we're seeing poverty deepen rather than widen. So over the last 20 years, if you look at those in very deep poverty, and this is where we're looking at people living below 40% of median income rather than the headline 60%, we now have 1.5 million more people living in very deep poverty than we did 20 years ago. So that's 6 million people at the moment. And then if you go even further down to a metric we call destitution, which is the deepest form of poverty we look at the JRF, that's rising even faster. So nearly 4 million people experienced destitution in 2022, and that's up about 150% more or less in 5 years. And that includes 1 million children experiencing destitution, 3 times the level that we saw in 2017. So people are in effect moving further and further below the poverty line. And one of our findings in the report earlier this week is for 6 million of the poorest people, on average, they would need to double their income just to move above the poverty line. So essentially, the further down we look into poverty, the faster we are seeing poverty rise. And then the fifth message I'd leave you with, and the final one, is that this is a choice. We know from history that we can change these numbers and move them in the right direction. We know that actually from our very recent history. When we published our report last year, we were talking about a dip in poverty rates during the pandemic, which was due to a combination of factors, but not least the additional support that was provided temporarily by the government. What we see from the latest data is when that support was removed, the poverty rate goes back up. So these poverty numbers are actually quite sensitive to government policy, and government policy has the potential to move them in the right direction relatively quickly. As Mubin mentioned, 2024 is going to be a year of important political choices. And our message on the back of today's report is that any political leader seeking to lead a government needs to set out a clear and ambitious plan for reducing the level, depth and extremes of poverty across the UK. And on that, I'll hand back to Mubin. Thank you.
Brilliant, Paul. You've done an excellent job at distilling a 178-page report into 5 top lines. Thanks again. We're now going to hear from Stephen Timms. Stephen will be known to many of you. He's been an MP just down the road from me in East Ham since 1994, and he's done a really wonderful job at chairing the Work and Pensions Select Committee, and in the last Labour government held a number of roles there, including as Chief Secretary to the Treasury. So, Stephen, what are your thoughts on what you've just heard from Paul? Stephen, you're just muted at the moment.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And I really welcome this report. And I apologise that I'm not able to stay for the whole event and the discussion that's to come. But I wanted just to start with some reflections inspired by the graph that's on page 7 in the executive summary in the report. And I should have asked for this to be put on the screen, and I failed to do so, but I don't know whether that might be possible. But because that graph, as Paul has just said, covers the last 30 years, which is a very interesting period for me, because it's exactly the period that I've been a member of Parliament. And I think it tells us a very interesting story about what's been going on. One of my colleagues, Liz Twist, in Parliament, asked the Prime Minister yesterday about this report, and he dismissed it really. He said, and I quote, "Poverty is falling in our country. There are 1.7 million fewer people in poverty than in 2010, including hundreds of thousands of children." And that brings us, of course, straight to the problem of the contested nature of the definition of poverty. Ministers have adopted the absolute definition. That is, people, those who are poor are people in households whose income is less than 60% of the median income in 2010, just uprated by inflation. Since then, the definition that's used in this report is people in poverty are those living in households whose income is less than 60% of the median income at the time. And this dispute on the definition of poverty does bedevil these discussions. And so I really welcome the initiative of Phillipa Stroud and the Social Metrics Commission. I know Phillipa's contributing later on today in looking for a consensual definition. They did, I think, make some good progress. The DWP said it would publish data to enable the Social Metrics Commission definition to be applied. That work ended in the pandemic for understandable reasons, but then the then Secretary of State, Therese Coffey, said it wasn't going to be resumed. And I think that was because it was showing broadly the picture that is shown in this report and shown in that graph on page 7. So I'm very pleased that the current Secretary of State, Mel Stride, has authorised the resumption of that work. And so there is again now the possibility that we might at last have a shared, a more consensual view of what the extent of the problem we are discussing is. And I think it will broadly be the picture that's given in this report. I took the child Poverty Act 2010 through Parliament, and so spent a lot of time thinking about the top line of that graph on page 7, which shows the proportion of children who are growing up in poverty. It's the highest line because the incidence of poverty amongst children is the greatest. Tony Blair, of course, famously committed in 1999 to eradicate child poverty in 20 years. And that graph shows that we did make significant progress in 1999 to 2004, as Paul just said. So that was the quarter way mark through the 20-year period, and we almost had reduced child poverty by a quarter, not quite, but not far short of that. And we then lost ground, a good deal of ground, during the economic crisis, the financial crash at the end of that decade. And much of that lost ground was then recovered, particularly, I think, thanks to the budget that Alistair Darling introduced in 2009. But we haven't really made any sustained progress since then. I think an important thing about that act, which was subsequently effectively repealed, but it wasn't just the statistical commitment, but the requirement on local authorities and on the government to have a strategy to tackle child poverty. Every local authority had to have one. And I do hope that that part of the Act, at least, can one day be reinstated, because I think that did enable some really significant progress. It does need to be acknowledged that things haven't really got worse since 2010 on the measures that we're looking at here, although some indicators certainly have got worse, like demand for food banks, and as Paul just mentioned, the number of households in temporary accommodation. Those have both got significantly worse since 2010. The graph shows as well a significant improvement in pensioner poverty, which has been much better sustained over the last few years. We've gone backwards a little bit, but government policy has been, I think, much more focused on pensioner well-being than on children's well-being, and you can see the effects of that in the graph. On pensioners, the recommendations in the report do recognise rightly the need for us to increase the minimum contributions for pensions auto-enrolment. Auto-enrolment, which has been a great policy success, wholly consensual. The idea was devised by Labour, legislated for by the coalition, and now implemented by Conservative governments. And it's done a great job in increasing the number of people who are saving for a pension. But the problem is, at the moment, they're not saving enough, and a lot of them don't realise that. And I think we are going to have to see a significant increase in the minimum contributions for auto-enrolment if we are to avoid a really serious problem arising for pensioners in a few years' time. But on working age benefits, the headline rate of benefits, headline rate of universal credit, it is at the moment at a historically low level. Roughly speaking, it's the lowest rate in real terms for equivalent benefits for 40 years. And probably, as a proportion of average earnings, it's the lowest level it's ever been. The Select Committee, which I chair, the Work and Pensions Committee, is looking at the moment at benefit levels, asking the question, what should the level of benefits be? And we've never really had an answer to that question. It's sort of just been the previous year plus a bit is what we've run with. We are wanting to take a more fundamental look at what should the level of working age benefits be set at, and we'll be publishing the results of our inquiry into that before Easter. And the JRF and Trussell Trust work on an essentials guarantee has made a very important contribution to our thinking about that. We've been looking in the inquiry at the extent to which benefits paid to disabled people and to carers, both referenced explicitly here, as having facing a higher risk of poverty, the extent to which the benefits provided meet their needs. And the Poverty Strategy Commission, which I'm a member of, has very clearly identified the greater poverty risk for disabled people, and Phillipa Stroud may well want to say, who chairs that commission, may want to say something about that later on. But I do welcome that. In the last couple of years of high inflation, working age benefits have been uprated properly in line with September inflation. There was a fair amount of pressure on the government not to do that. I very much welcome the fact that they resisted that pressure and that they have uprated benefits properly in probably the most difficult period with high inflation that we've had to do that. And I also welcome the fact that last year we saw for the first time ever an increase in the level of the benefit cap. And at the end of March, at the end of this financial year, we are going to see a rebasing of the local housing allowance that will be uprated to the 30th percentile of the rents in each local area after a 4-year freeze. And that is very welcome and will mean significant improvement for a large number of families who've had big increases in their rent over the last 4 years. The report refers to the possibility of the Household Support Fund ending at the end of March. I'm very worried about that, and I've secured a parliamentary debate about it in Westminster Hall next Wednesday afternoon. When the old social fund was abolished, the idea was that local councils would set up local welfare assistance schemes to replace it. Many did, but some councils didn't at all. And as council funding has been squeezed, those local welfare assistance schemes have shrunk. The Household Support Fund was set up at the start of the pandemic to enable local councils to provide financial help to people in particular need. And today, according to the charity End Furniture Poverty, which has researched this, most local welfare assistance schemes from councils are wholly dependent on the Household Support Fund for their resources. And if the Household Support Fund does end, then local welfare assistance is likely to end altogether in most council areas. One thing the fund has been used for is to extend the benefits of free school meals into school holidays. The Select Committee heard compelling evidence yesterday from the London Borough of Greenwich about just how important it has been for low-income families to receive the £15 per child per week provided during school holidays. And if the Housing Support Fund ends, then those families will be up against it in the Easter school holiday ahead. One group particularly dependent on the Household Support Fund has been families with no recourse to public funds. Many families in my constituency, these are hard-working families who in work, often been in the UK for 10 years or more, with children who are born here, but they don't yet have indefinite leave to remain. They've still got no recourse to public funds. They can't claim, therefore, universal credit. It's not completely clear whether they are eligible for help from the Household Support Fund. The government says each council needs to take legal advice on that subject, which seems completely absurd to me. But anyway, a lot of councils have decided they can help families with no recourse to public funds from the Household Support Fund, and have done so. And the situation of those families, I think, could get significantly harder if that fund ends at the end of March. So I just want to say again how grateful I am to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for the consistent and very important spotlight that that JRF is focusing on this subject, the long-term perspective you're providing. And I endorse the call for this subject to be addressed in manifestos for the coming general election, recognising, as the report shows, how difficult the economic situation we find ourselves in. And I certainly hope we'll be able to make some really significant improvements to the rather discouraging picture that this report has provided to us.
Great, Stephen. I think you've highlighted a really critical role that government can play, whether that's central government or devolved governments or local government in tackling poverty. Can I just ask you quickly, because you touched on this, which was the role of the last Labour government bringing in acts and strategies. Do you think we might see something similar if Labour were to win power at the next election?
I think we will see a renewed focus on the challenge of child poverty specifically. And I would hope, I don't know, I would hope that that would include legislation, yes, but I think we can be very optimistic about a very substantial government commitment to focusing specifically on the child poverty problem.
Great, thank you, Stephen. So now we're going to have a presentation from two of the authors of a report, Isabel Taylor and Peter Matejic. Isabel is one of JRF's analysis managers, focusing particularly on deep poverty across the UK. And Peter is JRF's chief analyst, overseeing its poverty monitoring strategy and its research report. So over to you. I think we're going to have some slides now as well.
Hello everyone, it's great to see so many people and thank you for attending and thanks to all the speakers as well. So yes, my name is Peter Matejic, I'm JRF's Chief Analyst, and yes, I'm going to walk you through some of the statistics and then hand over to Isabel, who's going to go into some depth of these statistics. But I wanted to start just to talk through the definition of poverty that we are using that obviously has been mentioned already. So basically what we're using, so we take people's incomes, so all their income sources, whether it's from earnings, from work, from benefits, from investments, add that all up, take away their housing costs, adjust for family size, because it makes sense that a family that's more members will need more income for the same living standards. So we adjust for that. And then basically we take the average and we look at people who are very far below that average. And other work has shown that if you are so far below the average, then there's things that people say you need for a decent living standard that you won't have the money to get. So that's our kind of concept of poverty that we're using in this report. And what it shows is that basically just over 1 in 5 people in the UK are in poverty in 2021-22, and that is a return close to pre-pandemic levels that you'll see from a chart that's soon coming up. So in terms of numbers, that means around 14.4 million people were in poverty in 21-22, the latest data, and you can see the kind of how that splits up. So 4.2 million children, 8.1 million working age adults, and 2.1 million pensioners. And just to put that in context, basically if you had 10 children in a room, the implication here is that 3 of them would be in poverty, 10 adults in a room, 2 of them would be in poverty, and 6 pensioners in a room, 1 of them would be in poverty. So this isn't sort of a hidden, very small minority of people. It is a sizable proportion of the population who've got incomes so low that they wouldn't meet what other people say is needed for a good standard of living. So this is the chart that Stephen was mentioning, that shows the last 30 or so years of poverty statistics. And what you can see is basically, if you look to the far right of that chart, a down and then an up, and that sort of, the up is the latest data point, and we think that up is because of, in part because of the withdrawal of temporary support. So basically during the coronavirus year of the data, which is the penultimate data point, lots of things were put in place, and we'll come on to some of those in a future slide. But for instance, the £20 a week uplift to universal credit was in place for that. And basically, lots of those supports stop halfway through this latest data year. So we see a bit of an increase, but what we're worried about is that that's only sort of half of the impact of that withdrawal of that support. And we'll have to wait until March to see what happens when a full year of data comes out that has that support not in place. And what we can see in terms of like the overall trend over the whole quarter of a century is that you'll see the red line for children is always the highest line. So child poverty has always been the group that's had the highest poverty rates. But you can see that progress can be made. If you look at the green line, very dramatic reductions in child and pensioner poverty were made in the late 90s to the sort of 2010 or so. But you can see again, it shows that sort of you need to kind of almost keep pushing on, because since about 2013, even pensioner poverty has been rising, but it's working age adults without children and pensioners that have the lowest poverty rates that we can see over the period. So looking at some more statistics about how to sort of break down those groups further, and also again showing the kind of interface between policy choices and these statistics, what we can see is child poverty has increased rapidly for children in larger families with 3 or more children over the last 10 years. But at the same time, for the other groups, for families in children in smaller families, actually, if anything, it's gone down over that period. And what we can see, we think that is down to is directly changes in the benefit system. So the free child limit, all of the kind of freezes, 1% up ratings, we think this is almost laser focused on increasing child poverty because it disproportionately affects children in larger families. And so that's something we're really worried about. So finally, in terms of groups, we've looked a bit at pensioner poverty. And so again, as I say, it's been on a broadly upward trend over about the last decade, but it's been consistently higher for female pensioners. And you can see sort of similar trends for the two groups, but basically about 1 in 4 single pensioners are in poverty compared to about 1 in 5 single male pensioners. One of the things we've been doing with this report is actually taking a bit more of a long run perspective on poverty and just seeing sort of how has that changed over time. And what we can see is basically, as has been mentioned by Paul, it's been almost 20 years and 6 prime ministers since the last prolonged period of falling poverty. And this is sort of the chart by administration. So before 1979, there's been some ups and downs, but levels of poverty have been broadly flat, averaging around 14%. In the 1980s, there was an unprecedented rise in poverty when there was high, but very, very unequal income growth. And that this massive rise has not been substantially reversed since then. And so this means that current poverty levels are around 50% higher than they were in the 1970s. And sort of just a kind of animation of that is on the next slide. If we just put on the Thatcher and Major government, we can see that basically in the 1980s and 1990s, that's that dramatic increase I mentioned, where poverty increased by more than 10 percentage points, and that is historically unprecedented. You can see that poverty did fall during the first half of the last Labour administration, but rose in the second half, partly over the period when there was the Great Recession. But they left office with poverty somewhat lower than when they entered office. And then since the Conservatives government has taken office, as has been mentioned, poverty's barely moved. It's been bubbling around the 0 line throughout the period. In part, this reflects the hits to living standards that have happened across everybody. So the global financial crisis, austerity, Brexit, the coronavirus pandemic, and then the cost of living crisis. So, it's not been a very stable 10 years or so, but equally, it does show that more needs to be done to tackle poverty in the UK. And below that kind of apparent stagnation, there's been this deepening of poverty that we're really very, very worried about, that Isabel's now going to take you through in more detail. And so I'm going to hand over to Isabel, if that's okay.
Thanks, Peter. So as Peter has just highlighted, levels of poverty across the UK have changed little in recent years. However, when we look at these overall levels of poverty alone, this hides the fact that poverty has actually been deepening over that period. So when we look at very deep poverty, we see that around 6 million people were living in very deep poverty in 2021, 2022. And when we talk about very deep poverty, it's similar to the measure Peter explained at the start. We're actually looking at people whose household income is less than 40% of the UK median. And so people who are having to survive on incomes far below the poverty line. So out of that 6 million people who were in deep poverty in 2021, 2022, this included 1.5 million children, around 3.8 million working age adults, and around 600,000 pensioners. But then also when we looked at data that was collected over a longer period of time, we actually saw that nearly twice as many people, so around 12 million people, had experienced very deep poverty in at least 1 year between 2017-18 and 2020-2021. So that's nearly 12 million people who had a relatively recent experience of living on incomes very far below the poverty line. And as Paul mentioned it in his comments as well, last year's Destitution in the UK report published by our colleagues here found that 3.8 million people experienced destitution in 2022, meaning that they could not afford to meet their most basic physical needs to stay warm, dry, clean, and fed. And this number included 1 million children. Now, these figures had more than doubled since 2017, but they were already increasing before the COVID-19 pandemic and the cost of living crisis. So the increase wasn't just seen in the most recent years. And to look at how poverty has deepened over time in the official poverty data, we have split the group of people in poverty in each year of the survey into 3 groups based on their household income. So the first group is people in very deep poverty, who we were just talking about. That's 6 million people in 2021, 2022. They're the ones who have an income that's less than 40% of the UK median income. So the lowest household incomes living far below the poverty line. And they're shown by the dark blue category at the bottom of this chart. People in deep poverty, but who are not in very deep poverty, then have incomes that are between 40% and 50% of the UK average. So they're the mid blue category in the middle of this chart. And then there's the third group, which is people who are in poverty, but they're not in deep poverty. So they have an income between 50% and 60% of the UK median. This means that they're the group that are closest to the poverty line and are shown as the light blue category at the top of this chart. And when we compare the sizes of these groups over time, we see that the groups of people in very deep poverty has become the biggest of these 3 groups in recent years. 25 years ago, around 4 in 10 people in poverty were not in deep poverty, so they're in that top light blue group, and they made up the biggest group of people in poverty at that time. But since then, the proportion of people in very deep poverty has increased, and at the same time, the proportion of people in poverty, but not in deep poverty, has decreased. And this means that the largest group of people in poverty are now living in very deep poverty, and so are having to support themselves and their families on the very lowest incomes, far below the poverty line. But there's another way to look at the depth of poverty in the UK that we have included in the report, and this is to compare the average income of people in poverty to that poverty line. This gives us an indication of how much additional money people in poverty would need just to move out of poverty, so just to reach the poverty line. When we look at the incomes of people in poverty, we see that on average, their incomes are 29% below the poverty line. This is equivalent to a couple with 2 children under 14 in poverty needing an additional £6,200 per year just to reach the poverty line. As a comparison, in the mid-1990s, this figure, that we call the poverty gap, was around £3,300 after adjusting for inflation. So this is another sign of how poverty is deepening in the UK. But then when we look at the group of people who are in very deep poverty, who obviously have substantially lower incomes, this poverty gap is much wider. In fact, on average, the incomes of people in very deep poverty are more than 50% below the poverty line. So in other words, they would have to more than double their income to move out of poverty. For a couple with 2 children under 14 who are living in very deep poverty, this means that they would need an additional £12,800 to reach the poverty line. Even just to move out of very deep poverty, a couple with 2 children under 14 would need the equivalent of £5,600 more per year to move out of very deep poverty, but they would still be living in poverty, just in less deep poverty, even with this additional income. But taking a step back from the very deep poverty measures that we just looked into there, we also see that there are these big differences in levels of poverty between different groups across the UK that Paul highlighted at the start of this session. As we've mentioned, the overall poverty rate across the UK is 22%, so around 1 in 5 people living in poverty, but this is more than twice as high for some groups. This includes people in Pakistani and Bangladeshi households and people receiving income-related benefits, where around half of people are living in poverty. Levels of poverty are also very high in lone parent families, amongst social and private renters, for disabled people and their families, and for informal carers. And the high poverty rate for private and social renters highlights the role played by housing costs in pushing many people into poverty. Private and social renters often have to spend a high proportion of their income on housing, and for many people, it's this that tips them into poverty. In fact, around a third of social renters and around a half of private renters who are in poverty are only in poverty after their housing costs are taken into account. In contrast, housing costs were typically not a big driver of poverty for mortgage holders or for people who own their homes outright in 2021, 2022. But these figures come from a period before we had seen the recent large rises in interest rates, which impacts mortgage payments, and the continuing increase in rents that we've seen since the data was collected. So the next data that will be released will give us more insights into how housing costs are impacting different types of homeowners, home buyers, and renters. When we look at poverty rates amongst children specifically, we see that poverty is much higher in families where childcare responsibilities are more likely to impact parents or caregivers' ability to work. So this includes children in lone parent families, where 44% of children are living in poverty. And these are families where a single parent may have to balance work and childcare responsibilities alone. We also see very high poverty rates in children in families with 3 or more children. And as Peter explained earlier in the presentation, larger families are also disproportionately impacted by changes to the benefit system that has helped to push child poverty in bigger families up over recent years. In fact, now child poverty is 20 points higher in families with 3 or more children than it is in smaller families. But also we see higher child poverty rates in families with younger children. That includes in families with children under 5 years old, so where there is a child who is a preschool age. And when we look at levels of poverty amongst working age adults only, we see that work in itself does not necessarily protect people from poverty. In fact, almost 2/3 of working age adults in poverty live in a household where at least one person is in work. And that is a slight increase from the previous year's data. But amongst people in work, we also see that there are big differences in poverty rates too. Both part-time workers and self-employed workers are more than twice as likely as full-time workers or employees to be in poverty. And we also see big differences between people working in different sectors. The highest poverty rates we see in the latest data are amongst people who work in administration and support activities, in accommodation and food services, and in other types of service activities, where jobs are often insecure or low paid. There are also notable variations in poverty rates between the nations and regions of the UK. While poverty rates are relatively similar in England, Wales, and Scotland, they were lower in Northern Ireland in the latest data. And then when we look at poverty rates across the English regions, we see that West Midlands had the highest rate in the latest data, followed by the North East and London. Then slightly lower rates were seen in Yorkshire and the Humber, the East Midlands, and the North West. But in these different regions, it's likely that these high levels of poverty are driven by different factors. The higher levels of renting and the higher costs of housing are a substantial driver in larger cities in particular, and so that includes a lot of London. But lower rates of employment and fewer employment opportunities, as well as lower paid roles that are available for work, are bigger drivers in areas like the West Midlands and the North East of England, where poverty rates are particularly high. But we also know that levels of hardship vary a lot within as well as between regions. And this can be seen when we use Loughborough University's child poverty estimates to compare levels of child poverty between individual local authorities across the UK. And in this chart, each dot represents the child poverty rate for a local authority in each region or nation. And the amount which they are spread out from left to right reflects how much these levels vary within that region or within that nation. So London, at the bottom of the chart, actually has the local authority with the highest, and the local authority with the lowest child poverty rates. So there's a huge variation in levels of child poverty across London. There are much smaller ranges in Northern Ireland and in Wales at the top of the graph, where child poverty rates are that little bit lower, and smaller ranges in the northeast of England, although child poverty is much higher in this region. So the figures we have seen so far are all from the latest data used for the UK's official poverty statistics, but that was collected between April 2021 and March 2022. And since then, the situation is likely to have got even worse. So the latest data only captures the beginning of the cost of living crisis. And as Peter mentioned, for the first half of the survey year, some of the temporary COVID measures were still in place that offered support that might have helped alleviate some poverty amongst some families at that time. So it covers a period shaded in grey here on this chart. And as I mentioned, many of the temporary COVID-related support measures were still in place at that time. So the next set of data, which will be released in March this year, will show what happened to poverty since then, including when the cost of living crisis escalated from 2020-22 onwards. So before we have that data, and to paint a better picture of what has likely happened since then, we've looked across a range of other data sources to look at the experiences of low-income families across the country. Our own research here at JRF has shown how much people have been struggling since that poverty data was collected. In October 2023, our cost of living tracker found that even after the height of the recent cost of living crisis, 2.8 million of the poorest fifth of families were in arrears with their household bills or behind on scheduled lending payments. 4.2 million of these families were going without essentials, and 3.4 million households in this poorest fifth of incomes were reported that they did not have enough money for food. At the same time, we've seen other bits of data support this increasing hardship, things like the number of emergency food parcels being delivered in the Trussell Trust network continuing to rise to record levels in their most recent data. And what we've seen is that the level of hardship that we saw in our cost of living tracker in October 2022 was only marginally higher than it was a year later in the most recent data. So even though benefits were rated in line with inflation in April 2023, and the cost of living payments were introduced and awarded to people on means-tested benefits, high levels of hardship persisted during this time in the poorest households. And we also know that the financial strain that is faced by people in low-income households can have an extensive and wide-ranging impact on their lives. As one example of this, the Financial Conduct Authority's Financial Lives Survey found that in 2022, more than half of people in low-income households with debt felt anxious or stressed because of it. Around 3 in 10 said that they felt embarrassed or were lonely or had nowhere to turn because of this debt, and at least 1 in 8 said that it had affected their work or their personal relationships. And these experiences were all much more common in low-income households in debt than in higher-income households in debt, though it's not unusual for debt to still cause anxiety and stress in particular in some of these higher-income households. But unfortunately, it looks like there will be many more challenges ahead. Inflation is still running at twice its target level. Benefits are taking time to catch up with rising prices. Employment is starting to fall. Earnings are still below their 2008 levels, and housing costs, both mortgages and rents, are increasing rapidly. Given the Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts that average household disposable incomes will continue to fall until 2024-2025, these effects will have a profound impact on many people's living standards for many years to come. So without decisive action to address poverty, we will continue to see increasing and deepening hardship across the UK.
Thanks, Isabel. So I just wanted to conclude with some remarks, but then hopefully sort of some challenges for the panel as well. So, and basically what we're saying is, as we approach a general election, political parties must urgently address entrenched levels of poverty. And the next slide shows one of our kind of concluding remarks from our 2021 UK poverty report, so just after the last election. And what we said there was, for a decent standard of living, we all need security and stability in our lives, secure housing, a reliable income, and support when things get difficult. For too many of us, there is no such security. Millions of people in the UK are struggling to get by, leading insecure and precarious lives, held back from improving their living standards. It's time to take action on poverty and put this right. And basically, that's still our clarion call ahead of this next general election, that, you know, this is something we really need, you know, people, the political parties, to step up and address. And we've got some ideas about where solutions can be found. You know, as we saw from some of our early charts, progress can be made. But I think people experiencing poverty, especially deep poverty, will be looking for plans from parties to ensure they are not left unprotected when times are hard. So we need a vision for reducing the level, depth and extremes of poverty across the UK. And we need a suite of policies that will make up a coherent overall plan to end poverty in the UK that's actually proportionate to the size of the problem. And one of the things we really sort of are lobbying for and campaigning for really hard with Trussell Trust is to introduce an essentials guarantee into universal credit. That means that, as Stephen Timms mentioned, actually benefit rates are set to what things cost, rather than, you know, a rate that's been uprated randomly over the last 3/4 of a century. But basically, we think the government must act with compassion, drawing on the lived experience of people who've gone through hardship, implementing creative policy innovations, and basically build up a sense of hope for a better future. And that's what we really want to help them to do as part of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation across the whole of the sector. So without further ado, I'll hand back to Mubin, and I'm really looking forward to hear what the panel has to say.
Thanks, Isabel and Peter. And I think it was really useful to end on that note of optimism in terms of what can be achieved, some of the solutions. I think my experience of working in the sector for so many years has been, we talk a lot about the problems, but we don't talk enough about the solutions. And I think the job for us is how we get to those solutions next. And so we've got a great panel now who are going to be responding to what we've heard so far. And we're going to first start with Helen Barnard, who's a Director of Policy, Research and Impact at the Trussell Trust. Helen will be known by to many of you because she was at JRF for many years as the associate director there, and was also at Pro Bono Economics. So Helen, you are now at sort of real coalface at the Trussell Trust. So over to you in terms of your response.
Thanks very much, Mubin, and thanks to everyone at JRF. It's an amazing report. I think for me, the thing that is most striking is how consistent the picture is between what we see from this kind of gold standard research and what we see on the ground across the Trussell Trust network of food banks and what other charities like Citizens Advice are seeing. So all of us are seeing record levels of need. All of us, you know, last year was the worst year we had faced. We provided nearly 3 million emergency food parcels. The first 6 months of this financial year, though, have been even worse. The need has gone up. Things are not getting better. They are getting worse for people. Similarly, Citizens Advice seeing record numbers of people needing crisis support from them. And there's a lot of consistency in the long-term trends that we're seeing. So over 5 years at Trussell Trust, we've seen a rise in need of about 120%. That's very similar to the trend that JRF's destitution research has been seeing. And we are seeing the same groups disproportionately affected. So we see about 7 in 10 of the people who are forced to turn to food banks are disabled. About 2/3 of all emergency food parcels go to families with children. These are the groups who are on the sharp end of what we're seeing. And we see in the drivers and the impacts. So we see that work isn't providing a strong enough protection, particularly in secure jobs. We are seeing food banks having to change their opening hours because they have to be there for people who are working, for instance. That didn't used to be the case. And I think the crucial thing for us is the way that social security is utterly failing to perform its most basic job of protecting us all from extreme hardship when we fall on tough times. So we know from the government's own official statistics, the majority of people who are getting universal credit are food insecure. They can't afford to eat properly. We know from other research that 9 in 10 people on universal credit can't afford essentials. And I think the real message, I think, that I felt reading this and the kind of year we've had is that the scale and the depth of poverty has gone far beyond what we can expect charities or the voluntary sector to hope to cope with and to tackle. Because there are some things that charities are best placed to do that we want to do. You know, building community connections on the ground, helping people find and connect with the right support, having peer support networks, addressing social isolation. Those are all things that we can do, that we want to do. What's happening now, though, is that more and more charities are finding what they're actually having to do is compensate for the failures of successive governments and the failures of other actors like employers who are not providing the kind of jobs that will protect people. And we can't keep up. You know, we are a sticking plaster, but the wound we're trying to cover has just got too big. So I think this has to be the year when politicians across the board recognise this has gone too far and they step in to do their bit to turn the tide. Because I always think there are a few big things we need government to do. We need them to get social security to be adequate. We need them to fund local government services. We need them to have the right regulations to get employment to be of the right quality. We need them to create a housing market that lets people access a decent home they can afford. If they can get those big things right, then actually there's an army of volunteers and charities out there who can take care of a lot of the rest. But at the moment, we are not seeing government do these big things that would free up all the energy of people in communities to do, you know, the rest, which is what we really should be there for. So thank you very much, Anna, for this research. It's really, really important. You're on mute, Mubin.
Thanks, Helen. Always a problem trying to unmute yourself. I think you highlight the real difficulties that charities face in terms of just the huge problems, the depth of poverty and, you know, the limited actions that they can take. You know, we do need these much bigger players, such as the government and employers, stepping up to the mark. So now we're going to hear from Shirley Widdop. And Shirley is an anti-poverty campaigner with lived experience. She's a member of JRF's Grassroots Poverty Action Group and has previously been an ambassador for Fair by Design and Gingerbread. So Shirley, great to have you here. Be lovely to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Mubin, and congratulations to JRF for highlighting this massive issue in a most excellent report. And going to the report, this report echoes my life as a disabled lone parent and carer. I've been in receipt of legacy benefits since 2005, when I fled the marital home due to domestic violence. I was homeless with 3 children, the youngest 7 months old. I was on unpaid maternity leave from my post as a sister in my local NHS hospital. And I left home with my children, the clothes on our back, and my car. That was it. Thanks to the New Deal for lone parents, however, I managed to return to the workplace, but it was as a part-time home help on £7 an hour. But then disaster struck and I became disabled in 2011 and unable to work. I live in Keighley in West Yorkshire, a town that comprises just over 57,000 residents. Poverty rates are 23% for Yorkshire and Humpside as a whole. Keighley itself is a deprived area in the centre, and it's clear from what I see day to day that people are feeling desperate and some are resorting to desperate measures. My local newspaper increasingly names and shames folk for allegedly shoplifting from stores or dodging fares on trains. Infant formula is being kept behind locked perspex boxes, and higher value items like meat and cheese and coffee are security tagged. In Keighley, we now have a social supermarket and 6 food banks that I know of, including one in my local community centre. Not free food, mind you. The majority of the food banks still require a referral from a professional agency. Before austerity, food banks were practically unheard of, apart from help from Salvation Army. I've previously been in debt. Thanks to Step Change, the debt charity, I managed to get out of debt in 2019, but due to the cost of living crisis and the pandemic, even though my credit score had improved by that time, I feel that I'm slipping under again. I've been missing the occasional direct debits and have been fined for it. I've increasingly had to put food and diesel for the car on credit cards. Not ideal, especially as interest rates are rising by 11% in one instance. I credit card shuffle constantly to stay afloat. I choose not to use food banks because of the people that are much worse off than me. As long as I have access to credit, I'll get by. But it shouldn't have to be this way. Living life on a knife edge is so stressful. As a member of JRF's Grassroots Poverty Action Group, and also as a participant in the University of York's Changing Realities project, I've heard many stories about people struggling financially. For example, people working 2 or even 3 jobs to make ends meet. My middle son is one of those. People moving home because of sky-high rents, especially down south. Downsizing because of the bedroom tax, or being ineligible for widowed parents' allowance because although cohabiting, they weren't married. Ordinary people are rationing heating, lighting, hot water, hygiene needs and laundry. They skip meals or eat leftovers so their children don't go hungry. They can't afford to go out and participate in society due to poor transport infrastructure or petrol or diesel being too expensive. Their physical and mental health and that of their children is suffering as a result. Worryingly, there are stories of people feeling obliged to turn to sex work, drug dealing, begging, gambling, or resorting to illegal loan sharks because they just can't access usual avenues of credit. Where's the justice and dignity in that? I myself am very lucky. I receive full disability benefits, ESA and PIP, but it took me 7 years, 3 mandatory reconsiderations and 3 appeals to get to that point. What a waste of time and money. It left me destitute, but I am just one of many. I find that PIP, my PIP, is constantly subsumed into the household budget. Without it, me and my 19-year-old neurodivergent son, who's currently in full-time education, wouldn't manage. Last year's uprating of benefits was very welcome, but because I receive carer's allowance caring for my son, £30 per week is still docked from my ESA due to rules about crossover benefits, so finances remain precarious. I myself am a walking quadriplegic due to an incurable spinal cord injury, which makes body temperature regulation difficult. My condition worsens when the house is too cold. Yet I no longer qualify for the warm home discount as I once did since the eligibility criteria changed recently, ironically because I don't use enough energy. Despite living in a modern 12-year-old energy efficient home that's supposedly fully insulated, it's cold and it's drafty. It reaches 10.5 degrees centigrade on colder days before I risk putting the heating on because I can't afford for my direct debit to increase anymore. I'm due to migrate onto universal credit in the summer. I'm dreading it, particularly the 5-week wait for the first payment. Like many people, I simply don't have enough spare money left over to squirrel away to stay afloat during the transition. An interest-free loan is available, but repayments tend to leave folks struggling even more. During the pandemic, temporary financial support, such as the £20 per week uplift for universal credit claimants, was a welcome lifeline, but distribution was inequitable. 2 million people on legacy benefits like me were excluded. The cost of living payments from the DWP and the Household Support Fund from the local council were invaluable, but these are due to be withdrawn in the spring, resulting in yet more insecurity as the cost of living crisis is not yet resolved. Access to a safe, secure space to call home, nutritious food, keeping warm, clean and healthy are universal basic human rights that are being eroded. In 2024, in a country as rich as the UK, it's a travesty that our rights are violated so. Poverty can be solved with the right political will. Labour's New Deal years proved that. COVID relief measures and cost of living payments demonstrated that putting money directly into the pockets of those on the lowest incomes kept families and local economies afloat. A healthier society means increased productivity and an improved economy, and it makes sound business sense to me to ensure that happens. So how can we do that? Some of my solutions include putting people before profits, pay them what they're worth, guarantee indexed linked living wages for those in work, ideally to render tax credits or universal credit obsolete. Ensure social security payments are sufficient to meet people's needs in the first place without having to resort to piecemeal sticking plaster solutions such as extra cost of living payments. Ensure that the wealthiest, including corporations, pay their fair share of tax to fund this. And also, I'd like to see a return to the more compassionate New Deal days rather than the current punitive sanction-led conditionality of the DWP, which we know from research does not encourage people into work. We need more carrots and less stick. Scrap the 2-child limit on child benefit as it disproportionately disadvantages and discriminates against larger families. Universal credit's here to stay, I'd wager. So I'd like to see a simplified system so that a claim triggers a coordinated pathway through to ensure claimants receive all the information they need about their entitlements so that the current £19 billion of benefits that have gone unclaimed reaches the people who need it most. But finally, and to conclude, too many people still don't believe poverty exists in the UK. It's vital to shift their perspective by rebranding social security as an essential public service, a lifeline there for all should anyone be swept overboard by life's unpredictability. Thank you very much.
Shirley, thanks for that powerful testimony. The work of changing realities has really been excellent in highlighting the realities of living on a low income. And as you say, it shouldn't be this way. So thanks very much. Just as a reminder, we've got the Q&A function, so do submit questions, and there's the upvote element there too. So if you like a question, please use that. Next, we've got Phillipa Stroud, who will be known to many of you as well. Phillipa is a Conservative peer in the House of Lords, and she's got a wide range of experience in think tanks and social policy, including, as we heard earlier from Stephen, as chair of the Social Metrics Commission, and previously as CEO of the Legatum Institute and chief executive of the Centre for Social Justice. So Phillipa, great to have you here. It'd be great to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Mubin. And also I just want to add my congratulations to Joseph Rowntree Foundation and commend them for this report. I know they, like me, feel that it's essential we keep the spotlight on the issue of poverty. It was interesting at the beginning in Stephen Tim's opening remarks, he commented on the Social Metrics Commission measure of poverty and how pleased he was that the DWP is now producing that statistic, poverty statistic in experimental stats that just went out for consultation last week or the week before. And what we've been trying to do is build consensus around poverty measurement so that it's no longer a political football and that left and right can agree. So I thought it might be helpful just to demonstrate how the data in this report does in fact line up with the findings of the Social Metrics Commission. So we too find unacceptably high levels of poverty that have not really shifted over the last 20 years. So we have, if you think of all the arguments and debate and discussion there have been, and you look at the full poverty line, it has moved a couple of percentage points one way and a couple of percentage points another. but really over the last 20 years has left around 20%, 22% of the population in poverty, which is quite clearly, in the world's fifth largest economy, unacceptable. Where there has been progress, we have seen it also beginning to unravel. I think particularly at that pensioner poverty line. But what that also shows is where there is cross-party consensus that we need to bear down on a specific type of poverty, in this case, pensioner poverty, and if that strategy is sustained through different changes of government, as we've seen with pensioner poverty, that real progress can be made, which is why it's absolutely essential that we reach a place of consensus. The most vulnerable people in this nation shouldn't be subject to varying changes of policy when there are different changes, different governments. There should be stability for some of our most vulnerable people. Another area of alignment is we would also concur that the experience of poverty is getting worse, and that has been particularly the growth and the development of deep poverty. In our data, we see it rising from 2.7 million people to 3.8 million people, and we are defining deep poverty in the SMC as 50% below the poverty line. And we can see that this is particularly acute for children and for those with disabilities. We see 58% of those in poverty living in a household where someone is disabled, either the claimant themselves or, say, a child in their household, and then also amongst certain minority ethnic groups. We need strategies around each of these areas where people are particularly affected. I thought one of the comments that Shirley made, and Shirley, thank you for your comments and for your honesty in sharing. But one of the comments you made was that your PIP is often subsumed into your household budget. When we developed the SMC measure of poverty, we included the disability benefits as an income line, but we also deducted them as an expenditure line because they're supposed to be for the extra costs of disability. They're not supposed to be having to support you in your standard cost of living. So we can see in this report that despite governments of all colours' best efforts, it can also be the macroeconomic trends that have the most brutal impact on the poorest. So I thought it was interesting, Stephen acknowledging that till 2004 they were making good progress, and then after the financial crisis they began to be their efforts began to be pulled down again. We've seen that with COVID, we've seen that with inflation, and we've seen that with the housing market. It's interesting too, and should inspire us with some degree of hope, that there is growing awareness amongst the public that something needs to be done. The British Social Attitude Survey in the JRF report you quoted, recording that 7 out of 10 respondents now acknowledge that there is a lot of real poverty. That data has gone up by 20 points. And it shows that there is a readiness in the population for a step change on this. Politically, though, any government will face the same challenges, a lack of money. This is clearly demonstrated by Labour's current policy, saying that they are keeping both the benefit cap and the two-child policy. Some interventions have been tested to the extreme as well. If we think back over the last 20 years, we've seen Labour take an approach of redistribution. I would say under Gordon Brown, we threw everything at trying to reduce poverty through redistribution, and we saw some impact, but nothing like going back to the 14 million in the pre-Thatcher era. Conservative and coalition governments threw everything at it through trying to make work pay. And whilst we moved the dial a little, nothing like what we had hoped to see. So you see two major approaches not really delivering what we would like to see. So it is quite obvious that we need a step change. I am completely convinced that this will only happen when all parties come together with a determination to believe the best of one another, and for each of us to take responsibility to play our part in seeing a generational step change. It's why I founded the Social Metrics Commission, in order to measure poverty, uniting left and right. And it's why I founded the Poverty Strategy Commission, in order to develop a strategy for addressing poverty, again, uniting left and right. And the Poverty Strategy Commission has identified a missing 36 billion. In the JRF report, you hint at this with your poverty gap data. I suspect if you sum up all your poverty gap data, you'll arrive at about 36 billion pounds of missing income in the bottom income deciles. And it's quite clear that in the current economic situation, no single party is going to address that gap fundamentally, which is why we're asking the question, what is government's responsibility? What is business and the employer's responsibility? What is the community's responsibility? And what is the person in poverty's responsibility? And how can all of those come together in order to generate that sort of step change? I won't go on and use any more time, but I'm very happy later on to unpack principles of a new social contract that needs to emerge as we move forward and as all of us together work to see a step change in an unacceptably high level of poverty.
Thanks, Philippa. That was a very honest assessment of, where governments have got to, and that need for political consensus. I think that's going to be at the heart of any government going forward. So we're crossing the aisle now to hear from Ruth Lister, as well as sitting as a Labour peer in the House of Lords. Ruth is Emeritus Professor of Social Policy at Loughborough University and Joint Chair of APPG on Poverty. She was also the former Director of a Child Poverty Action Group and is now its Honorary President. So Ruth, great to have you here and welcome to hear your thoughts.
And thank you very much, Mubin, and thank you to JRF for a really important report. And I'm glad that Philippa talked about poverty measurement, because I would take issue with what both Stephen and Peter said earlier about calling measures definitions, because the measures we have are all more or less imperfect attempts at operationalizing our definition of poverty, and JRF has a perfectly good definition. I'll put that to one side now. I think I want to pick out two points in particular, which are not new, but are no less important for that, and that is the disproportionate impact of poverty on children, especially in larger families, and this question of the deepening of poverty, the widening of the poverty gap, which was underlined by Philippa as well. And I think JRF is right to emphasize this, but there is a bit of a dilemma, because we have to be careful not to kind of give the impression that other poverty doesn't matter, that it's only the extreme poverty that matters. So it's getting that balance right. But it is, I mean, Stephen said, poverty hadn't got worse over the last decade, but it has got worse, as for instance, Helen demonstrated. It's got worse because it's got deeper, and I think that is where we can see the effect of the social security cuts, which Philippa conveniently didn't mention as part of the Conservative government's record, because many of those affected by the social security cuts that we've seen over the last decade were already in poverty. Therefore, that didn't increase the numbers in poverty, but it has increased the depth of poverty. And I think that's a point we need to make more clearly. But the report, I'm glad to say, and other contributors have brought out the importance of social security. And it also brings out the importance of listening to the voices of experience. And I was really glad that we heard from Shirley, and thank you for your contribution. Now, we've been asked to focus on the election, so I'm going to confine my comments to Labour as a Labour peer. The report emphasises the tides of insecurity, the need to expand the foundations of economic security for everyone. And I think, Shirley, what you said brought that out powerfully, that feeling of insecurity. And this very much chimes with Labour's emphasis on the importance of security. But they, and I'm distancing myself a bit from the kind of leadership here, they don't seem to make the link with poverty and the failure of the social security system to provide genuine security. And even though I think security provides a kind of political lens, a helpful political lens through which we can link the interests of people in poverty and people on middling incomes. I think what the report has to say on gender, although there's not very much there, but it's and some of it's between the lines, on racially minoritized groups, disabled people, carers, all can be linked to Labour's equalities agenda and need to be so. I think it's thanks to lobbying that Labour is now committed in its National Policy Forum document to a cross-departmental child poverty strategy, which Stephen was questioned about. But there is no mention of that strategy in the recent campaigning document. So I would suggest that those of you listening, a key lobbying target must now be to get the child poverty strategy into the Labour Party manifesto. After all, your report shows that there were achievements under the last Labour government, and that needs to be remembered. I would argue, and if we get that and we get a Labour government, then it would be very hard, I think, with a commitment to a child poverty strategy to withstand the pressures to abolish the two-child limit, because that has been shown to be a key driver of the increase in child poverty. And I would argue for a range of short-term measures to try and mitigate the harm that's been done by the range of social security cuts over the past decade, but also a commitment to a long-term review of social security so that it provides genuine security for all. And I think in terms of pressure on the Labour Party, perhaps the article by Gordon Brown the other day is very helpful here. And then I just want to finish with one general point, and that is I think JRF and others in the field need to think how we ensure that the voices of experience, such as Shirley's, are heard in the run-up to the election.
Brilliant, thanks Ruth, and for the reminder of really deep social security cuts that we've had over the past decade or so, and also what you're looking to expect from the Labour Party. We'll touch on that, I'm sure, during the course of the Q&A. So we're now going to move on to the Q&A session. So I'll be joined by the other four panelists that we've heard from, and we'll be using questions that have been submitted throughout the event. But I'm going to ask a few questions to begin with, and so just directed at each person, if that's okay. So Helen, as I mentioned earlier, there's these significant financial constraints facing whoever makes up the next government, and we've had really big pledges made to things like childcare, bringing down NHS waiting lists, workforce development plan there, and there's a stack of problems we need to address, such as social care and climate change. Where do you think poverty will come in this list of priorities, and what additional funding do you think we might expect?
So I think the way I see it is that addressing poverty, particularly deep poverty, is one of the conditions we will have to meet in order to solve all the rest. So if we're thinking about pressure on the NHS, we know from Michael Marmot and lots of other people that the biggest drivers of people's health have nothing to do with the health service, they have to do with the conditions of their lives. And if people are not able to eat properly, if they're living in unhealthy homes, if they're facing extended, incredible stress because they can't pay the bills and they're in debt. All of those things erode people's mental and physical health. That makes people less able to look for work, to find work, to do training, to get into the labour market, which we know is a priority for all governments. And it also means that there is greater pressure on services. And I think one of the patterns we've seen in recent years across both the local government services and charity services has been a tilting of services towards crisis interventions and away from prevention. And that's been because the need's been rising and the budgets have been cut. But actually what we're seeing now is it is vastly more expensive to have to respond to people at the point that they are in serious crisis than it would have been if we had had services and support available upstream, which would have prevented that happening. So I think we need to tilt back towards creating the conditions of life which let people thrive. And that is how we reduce pressure on the NHS. That is how we boost our economy.
And just to follow up on that, do you think that's how politicians are seeing this, thinking about the longer term, thinking about prevention rather than the crises?
I think there are people on all sides who really do get this. So we've seen people in Labour, Conservative, all the parties who will make this case. What I think we haven't yet seen is a kind of critical mass of support to actually kind of take the plunge and start changing those funding patterns. I think my hope, I think a lot of us here, our hope is, in a sense, things have got so bad now that we have a burning platform that whoever the next government is, they will have to respond to it.
Great. Shirley, I'm going to turn to you. Poverty was central to the policy debates 20 years ago, but doesn't feature the same way now. I mean, there's a lot of talk recently of living standards. Is this the same thing by a different name, or is it different? And do you think politicians will be talking about poverty in the run-up to the general election? And how much will this resonate with the public?
It's difficult to think how it will resonate with the public when I still see the old striver versus skiver rhetoric, don't breed if you can't afford it rhetoric, and all that. That's why I pointed out in what I said that it's important to actually educate the public on what poverty is and that it does actually exist in the country. I've forgotten the first part of the question, so could you just repeat that for me, please? So
we've really had this sort of debate about living standards over the last couple of years. Is that the same as poverty? Is that a better frame for talking about the issues, or are they different?
I think they're actually very different. You need to talk about poverty because otherwise poverty as poverty, and I don't mean like fuel poverty, period poverty, food poverty. Poverty is poverty. If you try break it down into little units like that, it takes away the seriousness of it. And also if you're talking about living standards, if you're in poverty, obviously your living standards are going to be dire. So it's important to remain focused on poverty so people take it seriously. And I'm hoping that people will see this report and actually start to do something, because we've been talking about this for such a very long time. I've been talking about it since 2018, and it needs tackling. And whichever government is going to be in power after the next election, they need to get the priorities straight. Poverty is a public, from a nursing background, poverty is a public health issue. If you don't get that right, then people won't be able to contribute to an economy, and it won't flourish, for example. Basically, more peace, less wars, in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I think, as Phillipa said, there's actually been quite a significant change in British social attitude surveys. That 20 percentage point rise in people concerned is really interesting, that people are more concerned about this and understanding the changing picture of poverty. So Phillipa, can I come to you? I mean, you'll be very aware, because you've done so much work on this, about disabled people and poverty. The government's keen to get more disabled people into work. Can I get your reflections on that approach, and also the direction of travel you'd like to see from the Conservatives in boosting living standards and tackling poverty for disabled people?
Thank you, Mubin. I think that, well, I remember very clearly that when we were in government, we surveyed people with disabilities, and 1 million of them came back and said they wanted to work. This isn't a group of people who don't want to work, but what they also said to us was that they actually needed the support to be able to achieve that, and that requires employers to be able to flex and adapt, and or work from home flexibilities and support within the home in order to achieve that. So if you just take, 1 million people who say they actively would like to be able to work if they had the right support, and start it there, I think a huge amount of progress could be made on that statistic. But it is going to require a support package to go alongside it. You asked me too what progress I think could be made, and here I think I'd like to just hint towards the social contract that we're beginning to flesh out with the Poverty Strategy Commission, and this sense that this deep poverty that has emerged into our thinking, our observation, the data, that should be our number 1 priority to eradicate. That Britain should not have deep poverty in the 21st century, and I would make that a number 1 poverty objective. I also think that we should be looking for a reduction in depth of poverty and persistence of poverty. So if somebody does fall into poverty, they need to be support mechanisms to get them up and out as quickly as possible. All the mechanisms should be supporting people out, not just sitting with people where they find themselves. And then the third is there are so many kind of lived experiences that people have in terms of mental health, indebtedness, family impact. The JRF report picks up on all of this beautifully. There can be progress on all of those indicators that improve people's resilience, so that they're then able to take the action that they want to take for their own pathway out of poverty. So I think those would be kind of 3 places that I would start.
Great, thanks, Phillipa. Ruth, you've kind of touched on this a lot in terms of your response. And central to the last Labour government was its plans to tackle child poverty. Where do you think that issue now ranks as a priority for Labour?
I wish I could say very high, but the very fact that it's not in its campaign document, as I noted, suggests that it's not as high as we might want it to be. And therefore, I think a lot of work needs to be done actually very quickly, because the manifesto is being drafted at this moment, just in case there's a spring election. I think it's important that the leadership knows how strongly people feel about child poverty. I mean, they are very aware of the progress that was made for a period under the new Labour government. Yes, they took the foot off the accelerator, and it sort of went backwards a bit, but then it was starting to go again. And the Child Poverty Act, of course, came at the very end of the Labour government. And I think, as Stephen said, what was so important there also was the duty on local authorities to have a child poverty strategy. And many local authorities are trying to do that with totally inadequate resources, but it would help them much more if there was that Child Poverty Act there. So my fear is that at present it's not at the top of the list of priorities, and it's up to us, or everyone watching, JRF, other organisations, to get it there. And I think Helen made a very important point about how if you don't do something about what is really quite shocking levels of poverty, particularly deep poverty, then the other things you want that are higher priorities, like the NHS, you won't make the progress. And actually, it's also, I think, very important to the climate change agenda, because we need a transition to a greener economy, and we need to be giving people secure incomes during that period to help them make the transition. And it's people in poverty who could be worst affected, and that could be used to try and undermine the climate transition.
Do you think part of the problem with like tackling child poverty is that Labour did throw a lot of money at the issue and didn't make as great a dent as they were hoping for? Is that part of it going forwards? It's, you know, it's a big problem which you know, we all agree needs to be resolved.
No, I mean, clearly the finances are an issue. Personally, I would argue that we should be taxing the better off more to do something about it, and that would provide the resources. And I think the record on child poverty is held up by Labour as one of the achievements, rightly, as one of the achievements of the last Labour government. Yes, it's expensive. It's perhaps, but there are certain things that could be done that aren't that expensive. I mean, like, you know, getting rid of the 2-child limit, it's not a huge amount of money that such a really, well, it's been called by Jonathan Bradshaw as the worst social policy ever. You know, I mean, nothing else you could do that. But so it is partly an amount of money. But I think things have got so bad that it does have to be brought home to, I think, the Labour leadership. This has to be a priority.
Yeah. Helen, can I come to you with a question from our audience, which is, why is pension credits at a higher level than universal credit? You know, they're both supposed to be based on kind of like the incomes that people need. Why is there a difference for older people and you know, those who are working age?
So I would actually question the premise of that question. So the question said they're both supposed to be set at the amount that people need. Now that is true of pension credit. That's not true explicitly of universal credit. So essentially, what was it, 20 years ago, as a society, I think, we decided that we were not going to accept the level of poverty among older people that we were seeing. And so the then government, with massive public and wide political support, decided they would take action. And the three things that created that incredible fall in pensioner poverty were changes in the housing market, so people being able to buy their own home and so they weren't renting in older age, increases in private pension saving through auto enrolment, and then pension credit. And when they set, it was originally called minimum income guarantee, it was actually set explicitly with reference to the poverty line, the amount of money pensioners would need to be out of poverty. And there was an incredibly aggressive take-up campaign. I was working with the pension service back then doing some research, and they were really pushing getting people on it. By contrast, we haven't had that public conversation about universal credit, about the idea that it is unacceptable for anybody to be facing deep poverty, to not be able to afford essentials. So universal credit isn't set with reference to how much do you need. It's set year by year with reference to the political debate of the day. And that's why most of you on the call may well know, that's why ourselves, Joseph Rowntree, you know, many others are joining to say we actually need to correct that. So we have in legislation the idea that universal credit and other benefits should at least cover the cost of essentials, because that's how we then make sure every group in society has that protection that we did choose to provide pensioners with back in, you know, 20 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Shirley, can I come to you? We've talked a lot about, you know, sort of central government probably. What can be done at a local level in terms of addressing these issues, given we've had so many cuts to local authorities as well?
locally, I think we need to focus on something called poverty proofing the school day. There is a charity in the northeast of England that does exactly that, by discussing ways that we can make people on low incomes feel less embarrassed about being on a low income. So, for example, free school meals. I think something like that could be done. That needs rolling out across the board for primary and secondary school children. I think the government really do need to fund the councils better. Currently, Bradford, if my memory serves me correctly, I think we're about £400,000 in deficit, and it's going to mean that cutting jobs. So central funding from government. You've caught me on the hop a little with that question. So I don't have much to offer right now. I'd have to sit and think about it, I'm afraid.
Sure, that's okay, Shirley. I mean, that's the nature of these questions sometimes. So I'm sure some of other panelists might be able to come in as well on that. But so have a think about that one. But Phillipa and Ruth, there's a joint question here for you, which is, we've talked a lot about what we'd like to see, but are there any policies from your parties that will be focusing specifically on tackling poverty? So maybe Phillipa first.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's quite interesting to look back at the autumn statement and, see what happened there with the reduction in NICs, an increase in the national living wage. Stephen outlined the changes to the local housing allowance, which I think have been incredibly welcome, and the uprating decision that people didn't think would actually happen. So I think our calculations are that actually as a package reduces poverty by 430,000. So it goes to show what can be done when there is concerted action. So I think some thinking like that, creative thinking, I think is really important. And we saw the impact of the uprating, the work allowances and the taper changes that had a significant impact on poverty. So it's very easy to see where choices can be made. I think just a couple of things I'd like to add in from the conversation that's been having. I've chatted with Stephen Timms about the child poverty question that you asked Ruth Mubin, and he was obviously at the Treasury at the time, and I'm sure if he were here, he would probably concur with this comment. He's with us on the Poverty Strategy Commission. He said he was acutely aware that in the early days of Labour, they actually did the things that are easy to do. The things that came next were significantly harder to do and more expensive to do. And I think that's just worth bearing in mind. And your question to Helen about the level of benefits. I remember, I think, chatting to Peter Matejic in government when he was head of the Analyst team there, and saying, so what was the thinking when the level of benefits was set? And it was never, ever, even from day one of welfare being created, set to any analysed point of need. And then all we've really done since then is taken this random number and uprated it, or not, or frozen it, as the case may be. And I do think we need a very serious conversation around what, if someone is working all the hours that God has sent them, what should be the level of support? They should not be in poverty. If someone is on disability benefits or caring for young children, they should not be in poverty. What is the conversation we want to have as a society about where we want to set levels of support for people? And I just don't think we've had that debate, even right from the inception of welfare. I don't think we've had that proper conversation.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Ruth, policies that Labour actually are pursuing at the moment.
Well, although they're not framed as kind of anti-poverty measures, but clearly would help people in poverty, would include, for instance, a commitment on extending the free breakfast programme, and commitments on childcare. As I've already said, I think more than once, that there is a commitment on a child poverty strategy, actually quite an extensive commitment in the National Policy Forum paper. Now, I'd encourage anyone to look at it who hasn't read it yet, but we have to turn that into a manifesto commitment to be sure that it is pursued. And it may, it may take time to be able to build that up into the kind of measures that are necessary. But Phillipa's point about doing the easy things first, as I've said, there are some easier things that could be done very quickly at not a huge cost. Could I perhaps pick up on the point about local authorities as well? I'm in Nottingham at present, where I live, and we have declared bankruptcy. And one of the proposals is to confine welfare rights advice to council tenants, social tenants, council tenants. And that's actually a really important role that local authorities can play, is providing advice on welfare benefits and on take-up. And I think that is diminished in probably many authorities because of the financial pressures. And Stephen mentioned the Household Support Fund. Well, there are a lot of, I'm not very happy with the kind of discretionary kind of fund, but it has played an important role at local level. As it happens, I've got an oral question in the Lords on it next week, because local authorities don't know what's happening. The start of the next financial year is, just a couple of months away, and yet they don't know whether they will still have the Household Support Fund to provide the kind of crucial local support. So I do think that is a very important point in the short term, at least.
Great, thanks, Ruth. Helen, can I ask you about no recourse to public funds? People who often are facing real difficulties, and that at the more destitute end. What action would you like to see there from the political parties?
So I think that there are a few things. I think one of the most important things is thinking about the Household Support Fund and local welfare assistance. So we heard earlier from Stephen that has been incredibly important for that group particularly. But it's been, as he said, there is a lot of uncertainty. There has been a lot of uncertainty across local authorities about whether they can or should be allowing that group to access that support. So I think one of the most important things is we need a multi-year settlement for the Household Support Fund. It's crazy that it's being done year by year. And we also need a much clearer strategy for what it is supposed to be doing, for the fact that people should ideally prioritise giving cash grants over in-kind support where that's suitable, and that we should make it crystal clear that local authorities can use it to support the no recourse to public funds group. And I think we need to think there is a kind of humanity argument that if people are here, we should not be leaving people to be destitute. But actually, there's also more of a kind of self-interested argument that when we leave people with no support, what happens is they often go into a crisis of one kind or another. And it is the local services, it is local health, it is social services and so on, who then have to step in. So again, I think we need to think in a much more strategic way about how we're supporting that group.
Yeah. Shirley, can I ask you a question which has come from the audience, which is about the role mental health plays in poverty risks, particularly for younger people, and have mental health problems been getting worse for this group? And you're on mute at the moment, sorry. But I'm not still able to hear you. Maybe other panelists can. I wonder if somebody from the tech team can help with that. Okay. Oh, there you go. That was it.
Oh, hello. No, I'll try. It's saying I'm muted, but I'm not, am I? Right, okay, cool. So just remind me of the question again, please.
It was the role that mental health plays in poverty risks for younger people, people in general in poverty.
Well, I can take this question from a personal level. My son, who is neurodivergent, has recently been diagnosed with ADHD, and also he's autistic. He also has complex PTSD, OCD as well, as a consequence of his life experiences, not so much through the pandemic, but beforehand. I won't go into the details of why, because it's a bit too personal. But certainly when he was at school, he's at college now, the number of pupils that were, for example, self-harming, it seemed to be increasing. As I said before, Keith was actually quite a deprived area, certainly in the centre. Obviously, we've got Ilkley and Haworth on the outskirts, so they tend to have a better quality of life out there. Yeah, I think certainly the mental health issues are increasing, and part of the problem is that CAMS, which my son has been part of for, well, since he was in year 7, actually, it's been stripped to the bone. There aren't enough, for example, child psychologists in the Bradford area to tackle some of the issues that the children are presenting with. In terms of, for example, ADHD, the waiting list for ADHD assessment is actually 3 years. And in the meantime, children are left adrift, try to cope, feeling very badly with lots of issues. In my son's case, it comes out as like being compulsive, overspending when they don't necessarily have the money, overeating, making potentially negative life choices that impact on their health. That's about as much as I can think of right now.
No, thanks for sharing that with us, Shirley. And, you know, clearly the real cuts which have been made to local authorities and the provision that they can provide has been, you know, devastating really over the past 10 years. I'm going to end with a question for all of you, which again came from the audience, which is, how do we get change? How can we build consensus on things such as the generosity of our social security system? So, Phillipa, can I come to you first on that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the first way of getting consensus is to bring cross-party groups together, believe the best of one another, believe that both sides, all sides, are genuinely committed to seeing a step change in poverty in this nation, and working collaboratively together until we have developed a full range of policy solutions across the world of government, business, the employer, civil society, and the individual, and then setting about implementing it. There's so much that could be done, but this issue of poverty has become too much of a war. That needs to stop. We just need to come together and develop a consensus.
Great. Can I come to you, Helen, next?
So I'd very much build on that. I think that one of the challenges that those of us working on poverty have faced for a long time, and it's similar for other issues, is that the kind of views and mindsets and knowledge of the people who are very close to this issue and who are working on it day in, day out are not representative of the wider population. And it is that wider population that we need to be bringing together around this. So JRF over the years has done some really great work to build up the evidence of what it is that resonates with the public. So there's a kind of, it's about building a big tent. We need to define what is the shared common ground which we can bring together a really wide range of people around. people who might vehemently disagree on lots of other things, but can come together around, and from what the evidence we've seen is coming together around the idea that everyone should be able to afford the essentials, that nobody should be left destitute in severe poverty. That common ground exists, but we have been quite, I think, bad at focusing on it as a sector and at trying to bring people in by speaking in ways that resonate with people who are not us. So I think that's a kind of key thing when we're trying to campaign and to build support for this. Start with the assumption that the people we're talking to are not likely to be very similar to the people who are, designing this and doing this work, and try and reach out. So it's kind of big tent rather than walled garden is what we need to be aiming for.
Yeah, I like that, big tent and not walled garden. Very, very nice image to have in our heads. Ruth, can I come to you next?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we have an opportunity at present, because somebody earlier did note, I mean, public opinion is more sympathetic than it has been in quite a while. And I think we can build on that. I think we need both, as Helen said, to be able to bring the issues and exactly what is going on in our society, which I think people are increasingly aware of. I mean, the food banks have become a very visible symbol of what's going wrong, but to make people more aware of that, and to, as I've said before, enable the voices of those with the lived experience to be heard, because I think that resonates with people. But I have to, I mean, I would love to be able to say, yes, we've got to build a consensus. But to be honest, I don't think politically that is the way forward, because I don't think there is a consensus. The present government refuses to accept that poverty has got worse. The present government has created, has been responsible for some of this deepening of poverty that we've heard about through things like the 2-child limit. And I don't want a consensus that has my party supporting those policies. So I'm afraid it does actually have to mean some differences and divisions between the political parties on what we need to make things better. Sorry, I would love to have been able to agree with Phillipa on the consensus point.
No, I think what you're highlighting is that there's not really an easy road there, and that there will be differences, and I think we all kind of acknowledge that, really. So Shirley, final words from you in terms of how we might be able to build consensus.
Well, we all need to talk about poverty in the same way, using framing techniques as advocated by the Frameworks Institute, where we're leading on values of compassion and justice, and how, where we might disagree, we can come together. For example, it's only right and proper that people are fed, warm, in a safe environment. So any right-minded person, irrespective of the politics, one would imagine would agree to that. And to borrow a phrase from the disability and disabled community, nothing about us without us. So this is where people like me with lived experience need to be included in any policy design. Because unless you've lived it, how do you know if it's going to work? Or how do you know if there's going to be any perils and pitfalls if you're away in an office down in Westminster working out what needs to be done? It needs definitely people with lived experience coming in to advise, if anything. Yeah. Nothing
Right, yeah.
without us.
Thanks so much for that, Shirley. I think I want to end, I mean, we've got to come to an end. It's come to 12 o'clock now. I think change really is possible. And I think we've seen that in the past. We saw drops in child poverty and in pensioner poverty. And I think key to this are the collective efforts of so many organisations and individuals, many of you here at this webinar. So keeping up momentum, being clear on the solutions, creating the shared common ground, which Helen talked about, and including those who are affected by these issues are key. So a huge thank you to everyone at JRF for authoring and publishing this important research, as well as for putting this event together today. And also thanks to the excellent panelists that we've had for the insights and contributions. And finally, thank you to you, our audience, for coming along today. So goodbye, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.